The smell inside a CH-47 at cruise altitude is hydraulic fluid and JP-8 exhaust, and the sweat of men who haven't slept in 2 days and don't expect to sleep anytime soon. June 11th, 1988. Somewhere over northern Chad. 2 Chinooks flying 50 feet above the Sahara in total darkness. No moon, no lights, no radio chatter. The pilots were wearing early generation night vision goggles that turned the world into a green soup of static. At that altitude and speed, a dune you didn't see coming was a death sentence. The crew had been airborne for hours already. They had hours still to go. Nobody on those helicopters was supposed to exist that night. The 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, had drawn what might be the strangest mission of the entire Cold War. Not a raid or a rescue, a theft. Deep in the Libyan-Chadian border wasteland sat a fully intact Soviet Mi-24 Hind attack helicopter, one of the most feared gunships on the planet, parked in the open desert, abandoned. The Pentagon wanted it. Specifically, the intelligence community wanted to take it apart bolt by bolt, map every system, find every weakness. But first, somebody had to go get it. The Hind was sitting in Wadi Dum, a former Libyan airstrip in northern Chad. The Libyans had left it behind during a retreat the previous year, and the Chadians, who lacked the parts or the training to fly it and had no interest in learning, had simply left it where it sat, exposed to sandstorms for over a year, still broadly intact. American intelligence identified it from satellite imagery, and the clock started ticking. The Soviets would eventually find out. The Chadians might sell it to someone else. The desert was already doing its work. Getting to it was the problem. Wadi Dum sat roughly 550 miles from the nearest staging point the U.S. could use without triggering a diplomatic catastrophe. That's the distance from New York to Detroit, over open desert. In hostile airspace, or close enough to hostile that the distinction was academic. A C-5 Galaxy couldn't just land there. A ground convoy would take days and be visible from orbit. The only option was helicopters, flying low enough to avoid radar, carrying everything they'd need to disassemble a 17,000-pound gunship and sling-load it back out. The mission planners at Fort Campbell had wargamed this for weeks. The Chinook's combat radius was the constraint that governed everything. 2 CH-47Ds would make the flight, each carrying a team of specialists and the rigging equipment needed to prepare the Hind for extraction. A third Chinook would carry fuel bladders for a mid-desert refueling stop on the way back. No forward operating base, no quick reaction force. If something went wrong over Chad, the Night Stalkers were on their own. Lieutenant Colonel Brian Doug Brown commanded the operation. He'd later become a 4-star general and head of all U.S. Special Operations Command. But in June 1988, he was riding in the lead aircraft with a set of NVGs and a map that showed a whole lot of nothing between him and the objective. The route had been planned to avoid every known Libyan radar installation, every Chadian military outpost, every nomadic settlement that might report helicopter noise to the wrong people. The flight path wasn't a straight line. It was a series of doglegs through electromagnetic dead zones. What made Mount Hope 3 different from 100 other special operations missions wasn't the danger exactly. Night Stalker crews had been flying into bad places since the unit's founding after Desert 1. The difference was the cargo. They weren't extracting a person or destroying a target. They were stealing a helicopter with a helicopter. The Hind weighed roughly as much as a loaded Chinook could sling beneath it, which left almost zero margin for error in fuel calculations, rigging time, and weather. If the winds picked up, the math stopped working. Somewhere around the midpoint of that 550-mile crossing, the desert below was so featureless that the NVGs became almost useless. No contrast, no landmarks. The pilots were flying on instruments and GPS, then a relatively new technology for tactical aviation, trusting numbers on a screen while the airframe shuddered through thermals rising off sand that had baked all day at 130 degrees. The Chinook's twin rotors chopped through air so dry it carried no sound beyond a few hundred meters. Nobody on the ground heard them pass. How does a Soviet-made attack helicopter end up abandoned in the middle of nowhere? You have to go back about a year. The Toyota War, and yes, that's the actual name historians use, was one of the most lopsided conventional engagements of the 1980s. Chad versus Libya. On paper, it shouldn't have been a contest. Muammar Gaddafi had spent the better part of a decade pouring Soviet hardware into the Aouzou Strip, a barren stretch of northern Chad he claimed belonged to Libya, based on a 1935 Franco-Italian treaty that almost nobody else recognized. By 1986, the Libyan forces occupying northern Chad fielded T-55 tanks, BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicles, Mi-24 Hind gunships, L-39 jet trainers pressed into ground attack roles, and a logistics chain running south from bases in Libya proper. Estimates vary, but something like 8,000 Libyan troops held fortified positions across the north, dug in around airstrips at Fada, Wadi Dome, and Faya Largeau. They had artillery and radar-guided anti-aircraft systems. They had the confidence of a force that had been operating in Chad essentially unchallenged for years. The Chadians had Toyota Hiluxes. That's not entirely a joke. The Reagan administration had funneled roughly $32 million in covert military aid to Hissène Habre's government. Stinger missiles, Milan anti-tank missiles, communications gear, and critically, about 400 Toyota pickup trucks. The French chipped in with additional Milans and some air support, but the backbone of Chad's offensive capability was a fleet of technicals, Hiluxes with heavy machine guns, recoilless rifles, or Milan launchers bolted to the beds. No armor, no air force worth the name. What the Chadians had instead was extreme mobility across open desert, a deep familiarity with the terrain, a tolerance for operating on almost no logistics, and a commander named Hassan Jamous, who understood something the Libyans apparently didn't, that fixed positions in flat desert are coffins if your enemy refuses to approach them head-on. Starting in January 1987, Jamous launched a series of raids that rewrote what Western military analysts thought was possible with light forces. The assault on Fada came first. Chadian columns drove through the night, bypassed Libyan outposts, and hit the garrison at dawn from multiple directions simultaneously. The Libyans had tanks, the Chadians had speed and Milans that could kill a T-55 at 2,000 meters. Fada fell in hours. The Libyans lost 784 men and 92 tanks. Those numbers come from the Chadian government and are probably inflated, but even conservative estimates put Libyan armor losses at several dozen in a single engagement. A French military attaché who visited the site afterward described it as a graveyard of armor. His word, not mine. Then came Wadi Dum, March 22, 1987. This was the big one. Libya's primary airbase in Chad, heavily fortified, ringed with minefields and defensive positions. Gaddafi considered it the anchor of his entire occupation. James hit it with roughly 2,000 men in pickup trucks. The attack started before dawn. Chadian forces breached the minefields at points the Libyans hadn't adequately covered, poured through, and began systematically destroying aircraft, vehicles, and fuel dumps. The Libyans broke. What had been an orderly defensive position became a rout. Soldiers abandoned equipment and fled north toward the Libyan border on foot. They left behind tanks, armored personnel carriers, radar systems, SA-6, surface-to-air missile batteries, ammunition stockpiles, and at least one Mi-24 Hind that was either unserviceable or simply couldn't get airborne before the Chadians overran the flight line. By the time the Toyota War ended in September 1987 with a ceasefire, Libya had lost an estimated 7,500 troops, killed or captured. 1/10 of its operational army, billions of dollars in Soviet equipment, sat rusting across northern Chad. Gaddafi's military adventure had become a humiliation so complete that he simply stopped talking about it publicly. The Soviets, who had sold him all that hardware, watched their equipment get destroyed by pickup trucks, carrying missiles that cost a fraction of what a single T-55 was worth. If anyone in Moscow wrote an after-action assessment of what the Toyota War meant for Soviet export armor doctrine, that document hasn't surfaced. The Hind at Wadi Dum sat in the desert for over a year after the base fell. Sand scored the canopy, the rotor blades weathered, but the airframe held together, and the systems that mattered to American intelligence, the avionics, the weapons pylons, the infrared suppression gear, the flight controls, were all still there. Satellite photos confirmed it month after month. A Soviet gunship, intact enough to study, sitting in a country whose government owed the United States a favor. Nobody in Washington debated whether to go get it. They debated how. The Hind wasn't just another helicopter. It was a category of weapon that didn't exist in Western arsenals, a flying infantry fighting vehicle that could also kill tanks. The Soviets had designed the Mi-24 in the late 1960s around a concept NATO planners found almost alien. Combine a gunship's firepower with the ability to carry 8 combat troops in an armored cabin. American doctrine kept those roles separate. The UH-60 Blackhawk carried soldiers. The AH-64 Apache killed things. The Soviets looked at that division of labor and decided it was inefficient. By 1988, the Hind had been in service for over 15 years, and American intelligence still had significant gaps in understanding its capabilities. The broad strokes were known. NATO had assigned it the reporting name Hind back in the 1970s, and various subvariants had been cataloged through satellite imagery, signals intercepts, and the occasional grainy photograph taken by a defense attaché at an air show. The Mi-24D carried a 12.7mm nose-mounted gun and anti-tank guided missiles on stub wings. The upgraded Mi-24V swapped that gun for a twin-barrel 23mm cannon and added the AT-6 spiral missile, which could defeat any NATO armored vehicle, short of a main battle tank, at ranges out to 5,000 meters. The airframe itself was fast for a helicopter, cruise speed around 170 knots, which put it in the same neighborhood as some fixed-wing ground attack aircraft. Titanium rotor blades and an armored cockpit that could absorb 12.7mm rounds. The thing was built like a tank that flew. But the gaps in American understanding mattered more than the known specs. The infrared signature profile was a critical unknown. Every American air defense system designed to engage helicopters, from the shoulder-fired Stinger to the Patriot battery, relied on infrared tracking to some degree. The Hind's exhaust suppression system was visible in photographs, but its actual effectiveness against specific American seeker heads was a matter of educated guessing. Getting a real Hind would let engineers at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and the classified test facilities at Groom Lake put actual sensors on actual exhaust ports and measure what came out. A DIA assessment from the period, declassified in 2003, used the phrase operationally significant intelligence gap to describe what the U.S. didn't know about Hind thermal signatures. That's bureaucratic language for, we're guessing, and we don't like it. The avionics mattered just as much. Soviet helicopter avionics in the 1980s were a generation behind Western equivalents in sophistication, but were hardened against electronic warfare in ways American systems weren't. The Hind's navigation suite, its weapons delivery computer, its radar warning receiver, all of these operated on frequencies and according to logic that U.S. electronic warfare planners needed to understand in detail. You can intercept a radar emission from a distance and learn its frequency. You cannot learn how the onboard processor interprets that signal, how it prioritizes threats, what it tells the pilot to do, unless you have the box in your hands and can run it on a bench. The same applied to the communications suite. Soviet military radios used frequency hopping patterns that NSA had been trying to fully characterize for years. An intact radio from an operational Hind would hand them the algorithm. Then there was Afghanistan. The Mi-24 had been the defining weapon of the Soviet-Afghan War. Hinds had devastated Mujahideen positions in the Panjshir Valley, provided close air support for Soviet ground operations across the country, and hunted supply convoys along the Pakistani border. The CIA had spent hundreds of millions funneling Stinger missiles to the Afghan resistance specifically to counter the Hind threat. And the results had been dramatic. Stinger kills forced Soviet helicopter tactics to change significantly after 1986. But the Soviets had also adapted. New flare dispensers, revised approach profiles, changes to the exhaust suppression systems. The U.S. needed to know whether the countermeasures the Soviets had developed in Afghanistan had been retrofitted to Hinds deployed elsewhere, in Eastern Europe, in Angola, in Syria. The Wadi Dum airframe was an export variant, which meant it probably lacked the latest Afghan theater upgrades. Even confirming that absence would be valuable. Knowing what the Libyans didn't get told you something about what the Soviets were keeping for themselves. There was also a less technical motivation that doesn't show up in the declassified paperwork, but that multiple sources from the Special Operations community have confirmed in interviews over the years. The U.S. Army wanted to fly it, not just study it on a bench, actually put American test pilots in the cockpit and ring it out. Learn its flight envelope. Find the speeds where it got squirrely, the altitudes where performance dropped off, the maneuvers it could and couldn't sustain. Fort Rucker's Threat Simulation Squadron had been flying acquired Soviet aircraft for years, training American pilots to recognize and defeat enemy helicopters in air-to-air engagements. Adding a flyable Hind to that inventory would transform the realism of those exercises overnight. Every Apache pilot in the Army would eventually face off against the real thing in training, rather than an American helicopter pretending to be one. The intelligence value alone justified the risk, and the training potential pushed it well past that threshold. And the Hind was just sitting there, baking in the Chadian sun, waiting for someone to come pick it up. Nobody involved in the planning debates whether the prize was worth it. The hard part was whether the Night Stalkers could get 550 miles into the desert, rig a 17,000-pound helicopter for sling load, and get back out before anyone noticed they'd been there. What does 550 miles of desert look like at 50 feet when you're wearing night vision goggles that cost more than your house? Green nothing. That's the answer every Night Stalker pilot from that era gives when pressed. The first-generation AN/AVS-6 goggles amplified ambient light, starlight mostly on a moonless night, and projected it as a grainy green image with roughly the visual fidelity of a security camera from 1983. Depth perception was essentially gone, and so was peripheral vision. The world became a narrow green tunnel, and if the terrain below lacked contrast, say, flat sand extending to the horizon in every direction, the goggles showed you a field of static that could have been 50 feet below you or 5. The altimeter became the only thing keeping you alive. The pilots on Mount Hope 3 checked it compulsively, calling out altitude to each other in clipped two-word exchanges. 50. 50. The Chinook's handling at that altitude left no room for distraction. A momentary updraft from a cooling dune could shove the aircraft 30 feet higher. A downdraft could put the wheels in the sand. They flew for hours like that. The two CH-47Ds maintained visual contact with each other through the goggles, which meant flying close enough to see the other aircraft's dim infrared formation lights, invisible to the naked eye, visible through NVGs as faint green pinpricks. Lose sight of those pinpricks, And you're alone over the Sahara with no radio contact, because the flight was running under strict emissions control. No radar, no radio, unless someone was dying. Navigation came from GPS receivers that were still new enough to the Army's inventory that the crews had trained on them for only a few weeks before deployment. The satellite constellation in 1988 wasn't complete. Coverage gaps meant the GPS signal could drop out for 20 minutes at a stretch, during which the navigators fell back on inertial systems and dead reckoning. The margin between on course and hopelessly lost over hostile territory was a matter of math done correctly under pressure at 2 a.m. Roughly 2/3 of the way to Wadi Dum, the formation hit the refueling point, a patch of desert indistinguishable from any other patch of desert, marked only by coordinates. The third Chinook with its fuel bladders was already there, having departed earlier on a different route. The aircraft landed. Crews stretched legs they'd been unable to move for hours in the cramped cockpit. The smell of JP-8 hung thick in air that was still over 100 degrees, despite being the middle of the night. Refueling a Chinook from a rubber bladder in total darkness using NVGs is exactly as dangerous as it sounds. Aviation fuel on hot sand. Static discharge from rotor wash. One spark and 3 Chinooks become a fireball visible from Libyan radar stations 200 miles north. The refueling crews worked with the methodical calm of men who had rehearsed this exact sequence dozens of times at Fort Campbell, and twice more at the staging base in N'Djamena. Nobody rushed and nobody fumbled. 40 minutes on the ground, then airborne again for the final leg. The Chinooks arrived over Wadi Dum just before first light. What the crews saw through their goggles, and then with naked eyes as dawn broke, was a graveyard. Burned out vehicles and collapsed structures everywhere. The detritus of the Libyan route scattered across the airstrip and surrounding hardpan. And sitting apart from the wreckage, listing slightly on flat tires, but otherwise intact, was the Hind. The rigging team was on the ground within minutes of touchdown. They'd rehearsed the sling load procedure on a mock-up at Fort Campbell, using a weighted frame built to the Hind's exact dimensions and center of gravity. The real thing was heavier than the mock-up. Sand had packed into every crevice. The rotor head was seized. None of that changed the rigging plan, but it changed the timeline. What was supposed to take 90 minutes took closer to 2 hours. Brown watched the clock and the sky simultaneously. Every additional minute on the ground was a minute for a Libyan patrol aircraft to spot them, for a Chadian military unit to wander over and investigate. A minute for the whole thing to unravel. The rigging team's sergeant finally gave the signal. 4-point sling attached. Load verified. Brown's Chinook lifted off, climbed to sling load altitude, and the 17,000-pound Hind rose out of the Saharan dust for the first time in over a year. It hung beneath the Chinook like a dead bird, nose down, sand streaming from its airframe. The second Chinook fell into formation. They turned south and began the 550-mile flight home. The first thing the technicians at Redstone Arsenal noticed when they cracked open the Hind's engine cowling was sand. Not a dusting. Packed sand, forced into every gap and seam by 14 months of Saharan wind, compacted into something closer to sandstone than loose grit. It had to be chiseled out of the turbine intakes. The Izotov TV 3117 engines, both of them, were frozen solid. Rotor gearbox seized. Hydraulic lines dry and cracked. Flight control actuators corroded through. The avionics bays looked like someone had opened them and poured in a bucket of the Sahara. Most airframes in that condition would have been written off as parts donors and stripped on the spot. The Army didn't strip it. They rebuilt it. The restoration effort ran through the summer and fall of 1988, conducted by a team whose names remained largely absent from the public record. What is known comes from a handful of sources. A brief mention in the 161st SOAR's unit history, some declassified Army Material Command documents, and interviews given decades later by personnel who were peripherally involved. The engines were sent to a specialized facility. Which facility stays classified, though the likely candidate is the Foreign Material Exploitation Laboratory at Wright-Patterson, where they were disassembled to the last turbine blade, cleaned, measured, photographed, and reassembled with replacement seals and lubricants. The hydraulic system was flushed and rebuilt. Avionics boxes were pulled, bench-tested individually, cataloged, and reinstalled. The airframe itself was inspected for corrosion and fatigue cracks with the same rigor the Army applied to its own fleet. By early 1989, the Hind was mechanically complete. Then came the part the intelligence community had been waiting for. The infrared testing happened at a facility in the Nevada desert, almost certainly within the Nellis Range complex, though the specific location has never been confirmed. Engineers mounted an array of sensor packages around the aircraft and ran the engines at various power settings while recording the thermal signature from every angle. The results confirmed what the DIA had long believed, but never had the data to back up. The Hind's exhaust suppression system was effective against first-generation IR seekers, but significantly less so against the newer seeker heads entering the American inventory. The specific attenuation figures remain classified, but the operational implication was clear enough that it filtered into revised threat assessments within months. American Stinger teams in Europe received updated engagement guidance based directly on data pulled from the Awadi-Dum airframe. The avionics yielded even more. The radar warning receiver operated on principles that were broadly understood, but with implementation details that surprised the analysts. The frequency hopping radio, the one NSA had been trying to crack from intercepts, turned out to use a pseudo-random sequence generator that was simpler than expected. One engineer who worked the project later described it as elegant but breakable. In the signals intelligence world, that's not a compliment. Within a year, the specific vulnerabilities identified in that radio had been incorporated into U.S. electronic warfare planning for the European theater. If the Cold War had gone hot in 1990, American jamming systems would have been calibrated in part by what came out of a helicopter abandoned in Chad. The flight testing was something else entirely. The Army's evaluation pilots, drawn from both the classified Foreign Materiel Exploitation Program and Fort Rucker's Test Pilot School, flew the restored Hind through a comprehensive envelope expansion over several months. The aircraft handled differently from anything in the American inventory. Heavy on the controls at low speed, surprisingly agile at higher speeds, with a tendency to Dutch roll in certain flight regimes that required constant pilot input to correct. The troop cabin changed the center of gravity in ways that made the aircraft behave differently, loaded versus empty. A characteristic American gunship pilots had never had to consider. One test pilot's evaluation noted that the Hind flies like a vehicle designed by engineers who expected their pilots to fight it, not finesse it. The aircraft rewarded aggression. Smooth, gentle inputs made it wallow, but firm, decisive stick movements got crisp response. The Soviet design philosophy was embedded in the control geometry itself. Fort Rucker got the Hind for its threat training program. Apache pilots flew against it in simulated engagements over the Alabama pine forests, learning its turn rate, its climb performance, the visual cues that distinguished it from friendly aircraft at a distance. It worked. Pilots who had previously trained against American helicopters playing the role of Soviet aircraft reported that facing the actual Hind was a fundamentally different experience. The acoustic signature alone, the distinctive chop of those 5-blade rotors, deeper and slower than any American helicopter, changed how quickly crews could detect and identify the threat. Gaddafi never asked for his helicopter back. The Soviets filed no formal protest. The whole operation stayed classified for years, and by the time details began emerging in the mid-1990s, the Cold War was over, and the Hind's secrets had already been absorbed into American weapons systems, tactics, countermeasures, and engagement doctrine. Colonel Brown filed his after-action report at N'Djamena on June 12, 1988, less than 24 hours after wheels up from Wadi Dum. The document ran 11 pages. Classification: Top Secret / Special Compartmented Information. Distribution was limited to fewer than 40 people across the entire Department of Defense. The 161st SOAR had just executed the longest Special Operations helicopter mission in U.S. Army history. Over 1,100 miles round trip, deep into denied territory, with a successful extraction of a 17,000-pound foreign military asset. And almost nobody was allowed to know it happened. The unit didn't get a parade. What they got was a reputation. Within the Special Operations community, Mount Hope 3 became a proof of concept that the Night Stalkers could project force across distances previously considered impossible for rotary wing aviation. The mission planning methodology, the forward-staged fuel bladders, the split-rote infiltration, the rehearsals using weighted mock-ups, became template for future operations that remain classified to this day. When the 161st deployed to Panama in December 1989 for Operation Just Cause, and then to Iraq in January 1991 for Desert Storm, the institutional confidence built during Mount Hope 3 was part of the operational DNA. The guys who flew those later missions didn't necessarily know the details of what happened over Chad, but the planning staff did, and the playbook had been written in Saharan sand. Khalifa Haftar's story took a stranger turn. The Libyan colonel who had commanded Gaddafi's forces at Wadi Dum, the man whose army had been routed by Toyotas and whose Mi-24 was now flying circles over Alabama, ended up in American custody after the Chadian defeat. The precise circumstances of his defection remain murky even now. What's documented is that Haftar and several hundred Libyan prisoners of war were offered a choice by the CIA: return to Libya and face Gaddafi's punishment for losing the war, or cooperate. Haftar cooperated. He spent the better part of 2 decades living in Falls Church, Virginia, about 7 miles from CIA headquarters in Langley, where he organized a Libyan opposition group funded with American money and trained by American intelligence officers. The agency tried to use him to overthrow Gaddafi at least once in the early 1990s. It didn't work. Haftar waited. When the Arab Spring hit Libya in 2011 and NATO airstrikes helped topple Gaddafi, Haftar returned to Tripoli and eventually became the dominant military figure in eastern Libya, commanding the self-styled Libyan National Army from Benghazi. As of this writing, he controls roughly half the country. The CIA's investment took 25 years to mature, and what it produced was less an American ally than an autonomous warlord with American training and a long memory. The Toyota War itself faded from Western strategic memory almost immediately, overtaken by the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the operational implications were significant. Chad had demonstrated that Soviet-equipped conventional forces could be defeated by lightly armed irregular troops using superior mobility, local knowledge, and aggressive tactics, provided those irregulars had access to Western intelligence and some French logistical support. The Libyan army at Wadi Dum had tanks, artillery, attack helicopters, and fortified positions. The Chadians had pickup trucks with Milan anti-tank missiles bolted to the beds. They won by moving faster than Soviet doctrine could react to, not through attrition or air superiority. The OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, was shorter in the back of a Toyota Land Cruiser than inside a T-55 turret. American strategists noticed. The lessons fed into thinking about asymmetric warfare that became central to U.S. military doctrine after 9/11. By then, almost nobody remembered where the thinking originated. The Hind itself stayed in the Army's inventory for years. Its ultimate disposition is not publicly documented. The airframe serial number, which appeared in the original exploitation report, filed under a DIA case number that was partially declassified in 2007, corresponds to an Mi-24 manufactured at the Rostov helicopter plant in 1978, exported to Libya in 1981, deployed to Chad in 1986, abandoned at Wadi Dum in March 1987, recovered by the 161st SOAR in June 1988, restored at Redstone Arsenal, flight tested in Nevada, and operationally employed as a threat training asset at Fort Rucker through at least the mid-1990s. After that, the trail goes cold. The DIA case file carries the designation FTD-ID open parenthesis RS close parenthesis T-0488-88. That number is the entire official acknowledgement that the United States government stole a Soviet attack helicopter from the Sahara Desert using Special Operations Forces in the middle of the night during peacetime. 17 digits. No fanfare. One of the Chinook crew chiefs, his name doesn't appear in any declassified document, but he spoke to a military historian in 2004 on condition of anonymity, was asked what he remembered most about the flight home. Not the tension, or the navigation, or the worry about Libyan interceptors. What stuck with him was the moment Brown's Chinook picked the Hind off the ground and the sand fell away from it in sheets, catching the first light of dawn. He said it looked like the desert was letting go of something it had been holding. Then he laughed and said, "We flew 11 hours to steal a helicopter that didn't even have wheels that held air." The United States Army at its finest.